Thank you very much, Al. It's a pleasure to be here back in London. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Today I'd like to really address the topic, as it says on the top here, which is why business aviation optimism really matters. And in the survey work that we've done and the analysis that we've done, there's clearly a group of people who are what we call enthusiasts or optimists about the future of business aviation. And they actually have some very distinct points of view, which actually by uncovering these and understanding them and sharing them with you today will give us some ideas as a roadmap to be able to overcome the external industry challenges that we face, and in fact that we saw here at the beginning of the conference, such as public perception issues. Myself, as Al introduced, I'm Charles Porteous. I'm president of Seefeld Group. We are a behavioral economics consultancy that specializes in gathering and understanding the market perception in business aviation for our clients, who in turn use this information to better design and sell their products, strengthen their brands, differentiate themselves in the marketplace, improve customer satisfaction, and ultimately address customer needs. So the feedback from you as the industry stakeholders is really essential to hear, because you're the ones who drive the policies of the industry. So just a little bit of background about the survey that was done. The idea here, and before I do that, I did also want to mention a very special thank you to Global Jet Capital, the project sponsor. It's been without their support, none of this would be possible, and they've really been a wonderful partner, enabling us to collect this important data and to support the project, not just here, but also at CJI Miami. But to give you a little bit of background about the survey, the idea here is really to understand and measure the mindset of the business aviation community on the critical issues. And that's basically, as Al said, that's you. The outcomes of that survey, which we actually showed the initial results in Miami, and now we're going to dig a little bit deeper with these results as we learn further insights, was really to benchmark the industry over the long term to see what the sentiment is of the industry, both in terms of optimism and on other topics. Identify areas that we can do better collectively as an industry that you are telling us that we can improve on. And then really understand, which I'm going to talk a lot about today, is that what are the different perspectives within our own community? And there are actually some very different perspectives, not just about how we address issues, but what the threats are and what the outlook is for business aviation going forward. So there's a lot of data that we collected, and I believe would give us, I hope to share with you some interesting insights about it. Before I start with the analysis, I just want to highlight that, in terms of who did our survey, we've got a very good representation of, and I say stakeholders, and stakeholders, what we're talking about is really you, the CJI community. The survey was sent out back at the third quarter of last year, just before NBAA, to all of the people who are in the CJI database. And this is the industry leadership, essentially. And I will stress that while the survey was done in October last year, and obviously a lot has changed since then. So my analysis today will not be so much around how things have changed with the election, or every industry news event obviously changes people's perception, but more to understand in the big picture and over the long term what people are thinking. And the good news is that we had a very good representation of people who have had different years in the industry. Age, as I'll show in a second, is really important. And obviously, there's a lot of people in this room who also did the survey. And I would encourage you, when we do these surveys in the future, please fill it out, because this is how we all can better our industry. So I'm going to just show you, this was a slide that was shown at CJI Miami, and I don't want to spend too much time re-showing the things that were shown, because probably many of you have seen it already, but just to give you a bit of a flavor. So the question was, which are the greatest threats there are to business aviation? And really, essentially, you can see it from left to right across the board. The theme of government restrictions and taxations is always there. However, when you move down the list, depending on where you are located, the different threats actually increase. And obviously here in Europe, environmental concerns are key. And outside of Europe and more in the emerging markets, operational constraints. So there's clearly, depending on where you are, really influences your perception as to what the challenges are facing business aviation. In terms of overall, this is what I call the business aviation report card. And this is basically you telling us in terms of how well is business aviation doing in addressing these types of issues that are on the left. And basically, if you look at the chart from in terms of what we do very well versus what we do not so well, you can see that we're doing a really good job. You think we do a really good job in terms of providing the appropriate infrastructure, growing the market, selling aircraft. But the part that we obviously still think we need to do a lot of work on is around addressing public policy issues and addressing that all-important issue of presenting a positive image to stakeholders. And one of the things I mentioned at the beginning about doing this survey over time is to see how this very list of perception of our report card changes. Just as a student would, if you have a bad first term, how's your second term doing? So when we do this again, we'll see if we've improved, or you perceive that we've improved on these topics. So, and also I think another one which is important too to show, particularly here in London, because we are the bridge between the North America and the international marketplace, and of course we're within Europe, is that if you look at the to-do list, which is basically what you told us in the survey as it relates to the priorities for the industry to work on, and obviously the taxation and the government policy issue is always at the forefront. But if you look down the list a little bit further, you can start to see some different perspectives on what matters. With the threat of the environmental footprint, not so much an issue in North America, there's a much more of a focus on changing the business model, enhancing the business model of business aviation through new product innovation and lowering the cost per passenger. But when you look over here on the European side, in the middle part of the slide, you can really see how the carbon footprint issue rises to the top. So again, the importance of knowing where you are really determines the list of where you think the priority should be. And in terms of the industry, it's very important to think as much on a regional perspective as it is in its totality. And so you, in filling out the survey, clearly told us that. So as promised, I'd like to move on to now talking about the optimists in the industry. And one of the beauty of the survey was that we actually asked at the beginning of the questionnaire, we said, okay, what is your outlook for business aviation over the next 5 years? And people were given the opportunity to rank their level of optimism on a scale of 1 to 10. And we arbitrarily drew the line at 7. Between those, anyone above 7 on a scale of 10 were considered optimists. And lo and behold, that's about half of the people that did the survey. And on the other end, you had what we call neutral pessimists, who are the other half. So we've got two groups of people overall who are clearly identified here. And overall, the industry has a mean score of 7.5, which is obviously the mean score of everyone together. But I really want to segment out what the optimists are thinking relative to those people who are a little bit less optimistic or a little less favorable to what they think the outlook will be. And this is where I talked about at the beginning, there's a lesson to be learned from those who are optimists in what they're thinking and their mindset that we could really benefit from. So one of the things that first gave me as the analyst some interesting insight as to what's going on with the optimists is really obviously a reason for being optimistic about the industry is that you believe that the economic conditions are favorable and that wealth and demographics is talked a lot, quite a bit. But what I thought was really interesting was the competitive advantages of aviation and the resilience and adaptability of the industry. So clearly, people who are optimistic thought that we have the ability to really demonstrate why business aviation is a highly valued value proposition as a category of transportation, and that the ability has the resilience to adapt to the challenges. So right there, you can see it just isn't about changing market conditions. It's the first evidence of an actual mindset. And that's a mindset that we can actually leverage and take advantage of to actually bring the industry forward as it tackles what we'd say are threats from the outside. Because ultimately, believing in yourself is your greatest strength to be able to address anyone who's going to come at you and says that your industry doesn't have the legitimacy. And clearly, there's a bunch of people that think that. So what I also thought was really interesting, when you profile out the optimists, specifically contrasting them against people who scored more neutrally or more pessimistic about the industry, you can clearly see that on a whole bunch of metrics, In fact, the optimists rate the industry just better. So again, it kind of goes to this point that it's not just about the economic conditions, it's about the belief in the product offering. You know, they're more likely to say the industry is innovative, customer friendly, but in particular, the differences between those who believe that it contributes to the greater good of society and provides maximum value is significantly large between the two groups of people. And again, this is this whole point about that the belief in the value proposition of business aviation is in fact an important tool that we can leverage in terms of sustaining the industry and getting others to believe in it. So another example of that is, we asked the question, what is your confidence in the ability of business aviation over the next 10 years to address these number of points? And clearly, again, the optimists are more believing that the industry they're more confident that they can address these points better than others. But in particular, if you look at the gap at the bottom two, which again reinforces this point that optimists are much more likely to believe that we're able to sustain the criticism from outside. And they're actually even significantly more likely to believe that they can make business aviation more affordable. Again, these are all issues that relate back to the value proposition of business aviation and its strength. Ultimately, those who are optimists more strongly feel the business model of business aviation and its value proposition is more viable. At least that's my interpretation of it. So in terms of how did people see the threats going forward, I showed parts of this slide before, but it's interesting to see when you take the optimists on your left side versus the neutral and the pessimists, you can see how the ranks in terms of the threats to the industry play out. So obviously, cost issues are actually much less important to the optimists because they really believe in the product, whereas the neutral and the pessimists are much more sensitive to cost issues and declining economic outlook. So again, that belief in in the product offering and its viability really defines how vulnerable optimists think the industry is versus those of pessimists. I thought there's an interesting one too as well, is that we hear a lot often about, will the traditional model of full aircraft ownership continue in the future? And it's interesting, again, if you look at optimists, they're much more willing to believe the traditional flight department model will be there in the future, or less worried, in fact, that it will be subject to vulnerability than those who are more neutral and pessimistic about the industry. I mean, I'm a bit repeating myself, but again, you can see there's this underlying strength in the belief of what business aviation stands for and the value it brings. So going forward, just to kind of move on and say, okay, well, it's one thing to say optimists believe more in the value proposition of business aviation. However, who are these folks? Who are the optimists? And this is where I talked about at the beginning of the survey, how in fact understanding who these people are and identifying what their profiles are is very important. And the good news is obviously that operators are slightly more likely to be optimistic about the future of the industry than perhaps other folks in different roles in the industry. But that's not a dramatic difference. It's not the biggest difference, but it's a good one because obviously operators influence the purchase decision. And surprise, surprise, that I thought was interesting, if you look at the optimists, they're actually the ones who are particularly bullish on the larger parts of the market in terms of its outlook going forward and its ability to outperform the other segments in the market. So clearly, a mindset of optimism actually does translate into product choices and favorability towards particular segments in the market. So again, the necessity to make sure we have maximum optimism is very important. So this is where we break down the level of optimism in terms of geography. I don't believe anyone would find this slide particularly surprising, given the headwinds that are being faced in Europe. However, you can see that there's still 35% of the respondents who did the survey who are still optimistic about the future in Europe. And I thought it really was interesting yesterday when we heard the really excellent presentation from Carl Mills at TAG, where he said that they surveyed the actual owners of the aircraft, and there were a bunch of them that were absolutely passionate about the value proposition and the necessity of business aviation. My hunch is they'd probably be in that 35% category there in the top. So you can see how the two fit together. And of course, the numbers go down from there. But I think the one for us that's particularly, that I found most noticeable and particularly most concerning is that your likelihood to be optimistic about the industry going forward correlates very strongly with your age. And so the people who are the most optimistic are those who are probably the wisest in the room, who are 65 plus. And we like to think that we've got some educating to do with those who are newer entrants into the industry. So again, it's very important to make sure that when we talk about business aviation and we promote the industry, we have to make sure that its relevancy is particularly strong with not just the totality, but with the particular groups of people who define themselves differently. And obviously, age is a key differentiator amongst us as business aviation professionals. So this is really, there's many more slides and much more data to have, and I'm very much welcome answering your questions, but I just want to leave you with a couple of takeaways. If I haven't said that the key thing that defines optimists is their belief in the product offering of business aviation, then I would, is this the slide? Is this, oh, there we go, perfect. So that's what I think is an important takeaway. So as we tackle the external challenges, my recommendation to the policymakers in the industry is that we need to do a better job to convince ourselves. So if we can actually encourage people to believe more strongly in what we sell, we're likely going to create optimists, and those optimists are much more able to withstand the criticism that the industry faces. So before trying to convince a whole lot of other people outside our industry how good our industry is, there's probably an opportunity to do more of it even within. And clearly, as I showed before, is that we don't have uniform consistency across our stakeholder group, and that's is much more important. So we should really look at encouraging programs and educational programs to sell business aviation and the merits of it on its own pillars to those who are among ages and in particular regions and so forth. So what am I looking at here, Al? Oh, this is live. Oh, great. So, so we got a lot of optimists in the room. Hopefully I've convinced everybody.
Do we have any questions for Charles? So I've got one. Just to recap, the closer you are to retirement, the more optimistic you are about the people behind you solving the problems in the next
Yes. Exactly.
And that's really all we needed. Any other questions for Charles? And the good news, actually, the longer we do this, the less optimistic people are getting. And on that note, thanks very much, Charles.
Thank you.
Thank you.